today. To you, I'm gonna give this lecture on market and non-market goods from the point of view of the environmental evaluation approach, which is one of the things that I must do really in terms of research. So let's start. A bit of what we're gonna do today is the basic definitions, the challenge of non-market goods. We will look a bit at market failures and types of values, and then we will look at environmental evaluation techniques. So, well, to start with this, some basic concepts, so we are on the same base. So, what is the market? And you as an economist may all know that a market is the place where buyers and sellers can gather to facilitate the exchange of goods and services. That's the typical concept we have of markets, where we have the supply and the demand, as we see in this graph, that gives us the price and quantity of a good. So, two elements that are key in this market is, first of all, is price. Okay, so we have the price at the point where demand and supply clear. And the other thing we have is, before going to the other thing, is that what is the price? The price really what gives us is the value of the goods and services. And other things we have here is the quantity. The quantity of those goods and services we are taking into the economy. So though that quantity could be of, as I put here, apples, it could be computers, cars, but it could also be services like medical services, administrative services, and another. But those are kind of very easy quantifying goods. However, we can certain type of goods that are difficult to quantify, but they are still services, goods and services, and they still have a demand. So what are these? Biodiversity, for example. These are comfort, clean air, clean water. So certain resources and other services are very abstract, and it's more difficult to quantify them. And we need this quantification, okay? Or the supply and demand give us as well this quantification to do evaluation. So for market goods, things are easy. These goods are sold in the market and they have a market price. So there exists a clear market on this, and it's easy to know the price. You buy a house, you get a service, you buy a car, as I put here, and you get a clear price for that. For non-market goods, so this is important to see, that is market goods, okay? For those, there is a clear market and we get the price. For non-market goods, these are markets that are not traded in the, these are goods, sorry, that are not traded in the market. Therefore, they have a no specific price. And then we say like how we actually can value, how we get the value of these goods. We don't have a market, so it's very difficult to know what's gonna be the price. So the challenge of these goods are two. The first challenge is how to measure the goods or services, and the other challenge is the price or the value of these goods and services. So let's see, for example, the cases of externality, and this is a very typical example. So let's take or let's assume a market good, which is energy. So we have energy generated by fossil fuels. let's say oil, coal, and gas. What we have here, then we have a supply that you can see here for this oil, coal, and gas. And then you have a demand for that, okay? Demand for cooling, for heating, okay? Demand for petrol. And we have our price and quantity. That is easy, okay? In terms of, we know the price of the energy. However, we have a market failure here because when we produce energy using fossil fuels, we have externalities or external effects. So what externalities we can get in here? For example, air pollution, we have intrusion in the landscape, in some cases water pollution. So we have several types of externalities that affect that. But what happened? The market is not taking into account the values of those externalities. The market only is taking into account the private part and not the social part. The social part is all the impact that we are getting from that production of energy. So we have then a market failure here, where the market is not being efficient. We have an inefficiency created by the no consideration of these external effects. So the air pollution, the health impact. And therefore, the private cost will differ from the social cost. You can see this in this graph. So the supply is, which equal MC, marginal cost. The only thing that gives you is the financial part. However, if you see this MEC, the marginal environmental cost, this curve, this is the impact, the environmental impact. So the more we move to in quantity, more we produce, we have an increased impact or cost. Can do that. So we have to add this cost of the MEC cost to the private cost. And we get this MSC curve, which is the marginal social cost. And then you see the first equilibrium, which is okay, considering externality. However, to make this market efficient, we need to work in the P star and Q star with a lower quantity. So the market is producing too many of the goods, and they have a lower price. So while the price should be P asterisk and Q asterisk. So we have an inefficiency in the market, and this is the market failure. So the source of this economic inefficiency is the social costly producing, which is incorrectly pricing. Only at this higher price, the PS, is where the level would be produced. So what we can do here, how we correct this externality we have in here. So we need to internalize the externality involving altering the incentive so people can take into account these external effects of the actions. So we need to find the incentives to make the price to come to the correct point. And how we do this in economics, we play with the incentives through the policy instruments. And okay, so just have a 30-second thought. How you actually bring this market to an equilibrium, considering or internalizing this social cost. What policy instrument will you use? Just have 30 seconds to think how you, a policymaker, would be this happening. And the answer to this is through a tax. So the government can internalize the externalities by imposing a tax on the producer. So to reduce the equilibrium quantity to the point that we desire. So how is the tax? So this is our private cost, and we have our social cost here, and we need to put the tax of this size as the purple line. So, and this tax, as you can see, if we put a tax of that size, will bring the quantity from QP to QS. So the efficient point at the price PS. So let's put it in a formal way. In the case of externality, if we want to model it, so we do this. If we look at this from the welfare point of view, so we have that we maximize the W, which is welfare, which is the price multiplied by Q, okay, or the benefit. Let's look at this as the benefit. The price minus the price multiplied by the quantity, so how much you get, minus we reduce the cost, which is a function of the quantity you produce and how much you abate in emissions from. So these are your benefits, okay? Minus D is the damage. So it's the cost or the damage that is producing the air pollution. And that damage is a function of E, which is emissions. And the amount of emissions you get is a function of the quantity you produce and the amount of abatement activities you have. So if you have this problem, this economic problem, and you solve for this, you will get that the price is equal to the marginal cost, which is this C prime, plus the marginal damage, which is this second component. And the marginal cost in here equals the marginal damage in terms of abate. So let's see then if we put the tax in here. Okay, let's what is the size of the tax we need? So again, we have this benefit for the firm is the price multiplied by Q, the benefit minus the cost. And now we put minus a tax, which is this T, a tax for multiplied by the emissions we have. So for every emission, the energy company is polluting, then we charge a tax. So if we develop this, we will get that the price in this case will be the marginal cost, the same as before, plus the tax. So let's see something here. Let's compare these two situations, okay? So the social solution we have is in this first column, and the Pigouvian tax is in the second. If you compare these two, what you will see is that the only difference you have in the second part, which is the cost, the marginal cost, or even in the first part, okay, which is the price, is this term, which in the social solution is damage, while in the Pigouvian tax solution is tax. So what can you conclude from this? If these two are the same, what is the size of the tax? Is the question. and this is giving you the answer. So the conditions here are identical as long as the Piguvian tax is set equal to the level of the marginal damage. So the tax should be equal to the damage. So we need to put a tax. We have the situation of externality, okay? The market is inefficient. We want to get the market to the efficient point, so we need to internalize externalities. How we do it? Through a tax. Next question, what is the amount of the tax? And this is telling you that the amount of the tax has to be equal to the damage of the energy production by fossil fuels. What is the next question then? What is the amount of that damage? We need to know now, in order to make the policy, to implement the policy instrument to get an efficient market, what is the size of that damage? What is the damage? But is this easy to establish? And the answer is no, because it is difficult to estimate the damages of this type of energy generation. And why is this difficult? Because we don't have a market. We don't have a market for the air. We don't have a market for the certain types of health conditions, okay? Nowadays, you can tell me, oh, but yes, there is a market because we have ETS, so emissions tradable permits, for example. But that is another policy instrument. So in normal conditions, we don't have a market. So what is the solution? How we can calculate its damage? So this is really the important point. We need we have an environmental problem. We need the value of that, but we have this challenge that is very difficult to calculate. So the answer to this is basically environmental valuation. So the environmental valuation will give us the techniques we need to calculate the impacts of energy generation or many other things. There could be biodiversity degradation, etc. Okay, so how we evaluate the externalities then in a monetary term? So how we measure the values and costs of non-market goods and services. For example, environmental degradation, for example, clean air, biodiversity. You could think about biodiversity and many others environmental goods. So let's look at this. So you need to get this type of fact. The first approach you will think of would be market value. Okay, let's see if there's a market for these externalities. If there is a market for the air, if there is a market. So some examples, as I said before, many of these impacts, they don't have a market for these goods and services. Some others have an indirect market. So for example, we could think in this example of the energy, we could think about the health effect could be measured through the hospitalization and treatment costs of people who have been impacted by the energy generation by fossil fuels. So people with respiratory problems, and so they go to hospital. That has a cost that you can calculate. They take medicines that they have a price you can calculate. So if you take all those costs and you add them, then you could get a proxy of the cost of that externality, the air pollution for energy production by fossil fuels. Another way you could get some values through a market approach is when you get, for example, change in property value. So let's say that you have a field and then there is a thermoelectric plant to produce energy with oil that is installed in that field. So there will be an impact in the landscape and many other impacts. So one of the effects this will have is the reduction of property value in that area. Therefore, you could calculate the value of that change, and that will give you the value of the externality through a market approach. Okay, so that is a way you could use the market. However, I'm gonna just pause here 1 second because I would like to tell you that if you guys have any question of what I am telling here, please feel free to raise your hand or post your question in the chat or interrupt me and ask your question, okay? So don't wait until the end. If you have a question, just feel free to come in, pop in here, and we can take the question during the lecture, okay? Okay, so then what happened? That we saw how to use market approach to value this externality. However, the market does not always provide direct information regarding the value that society places on changes in the provision of environmental goods and services. And this is taken from Perlman et al., his book on environmental economics. Therefore, because these markets not only provide this direct information, so we need we need to apply environmental evaluation techniques to get the value of the damages, and so we can design appropriate policy instruments. So when I talk about environmental evaluation, what do we value? What is that we want to get the value of? What we value is improve, and these are only very, very limited and few examples. There are infinite examples, really. So we have improved environmental quality, impact on energy developments, national parks, which means recreational opportunities, ecosystem conservation, exotic species, endangered species, government-provided goods and services, among many others. For example, I am at the moment doing research on valuing megafauna biodiversity in the coast of Ecuador. So there are several things you could value. Why we do environmental evaluation is the next question. The next and the answer to that is that the main motivation for doing environmental evaluation is to construct cost-benefit analysis. Because in general, the decisions to go for a project, for example, are based only on financial information without taking into account the social information. So if you remember, that graph is based on the private costs, but not the social one. So if we want to do complete cost-benefit analysis and make better decisions that make the market more efficient, then we need these values, and that's the main motivation of conducting environmental evaluation studies. Obviously, we were talking before that we wanted to conduct this because we want to design the right tax, the right size of the tax. Therefore, a second motivation is design policy instrument. These techniques will give us a tool to calculate the value of these damages that we will use to design policy instruments to clear the market. Other reasons why to use environmental evaluations to design compensation schemes. And for example, if a wind farm is installed in a certain area, so how we compensate the people that live in that area for the impact. And a final motivation is to introduce the values into the national accounting, which is something that is taking again a very good push, let's say, in many economies, in many countries. So those are the main motivations. Now, before we get into valuation techniques, let's have a clear knowledge about the types of values we have in goods and services. Let's start by the easiest one, which is use values. When we talk about use values, we talk about consumptive use and non-consumptive use. So it's the use of using, consumptive use is the use of using a resource. For example, if you go to a park which has a lake and you go and swim and enjoy the lake, then that is, you are using the resource as a consumptive value, or non-consumptive value are values like used for recreation. You use it for recreation, you use it for other benefits, okay, that you are using the good and service. But we always tend to just think about things have some value if we use it, if we use them. But it's not always like that. We have non-use values in which we don't have an interaction with the good. And we have three types of non-use value: existing values or intrinsic value, which is that the fact that the good and service exists itself, then we may have a value for that. For example, if you may know of whales in the Pacific, you may not use those. You may not use those whales. You may not see them. However, you still are willing to pay something to preserve those whales. Then you have altruistic values, which is the fact that you want something to be preserved, or you want something to avoid certain externality because it has a benefit for others. It probably doesn't benefit you right away, but it has a benefit for others. So that is altruistic value. And bequest value is because you are worried, or you are concerned about future generations. And this is something that I typically get in the research when I ask people, to value certain goods and services. And let's put an example. When we value the landscape, let's get back to our example of thermoelectric power generation. So what happened? We put a thermoelectric plant in a place. I may be willing to pay to generate by renewables because I don't want my children or grandchildren to see that area spoiled or destroyed. So I may not use it, but then I have this bequest value, which is I want my future generations to enjoy it. So again, non-use values, not interaction with a good, but still we have a value, we value that is a good or service. And then we have the option value. The option value is you are not using, there is no interaction with a good again, but you may have the option to use it in the future. And then you want to preserve a good or service, let's say a species, because you want to see it in the future, or you want to use it in the future. So for example, let's say you want to go to the Antarctic and see the big glaciers. You may be willing to pay for climate actions in order to avoid those big glaciers to be melted, because probably you want to go at some point to the Antarctic and see them. So there is an option value in there. So we have these three types of values, which is important to bear in mind, because it's not that we value only use value. And why we need to get to bear this in mind, because we have two types of environmental evaluation approach. And they value different types of values. They value different types of value. So what are the techniques we have to perform environmental evaluation? One is the revealed preferences, and the second is stated preferences. Let's start by looking at revealed preferences. So for the revealed preference, we only estimate use values. And that's why it was important to recognize the difference between the types of value. For revealed preference, we estimate only use value. And it's based on observed behavior, which means it's a direct method. So why? We have two techniques. I'm gonna go through these techniques into detail in a second. One is travel cost and the other is hedonic prices. So basically you will see how people behave, and based on their cost directly, you will have a value. The second technique is stated preference techniques, where we estimate not only use values, but also non-use value. And in this case, this is, in both cases actually, is based on survey data. We use questionnaires to get these values. In this case, this is an indirect method, because we don't get exactly really what they actually spend, but we ask them willingness to pay or willingness to accept. So in this case, we have two techniques. One is the continued evaluation, and the second is the choice experiment, which I'm gonna be covering as well later in this lecture. So let's go for the first revealed preference method, which is the travel cost method. The travel cost method is mainly applied to determine the economic values of sites used for recreation. For example, national parks. We use a lot this for places like national parks, really, the travel cost. We collect the data on the cost incurred by individuals when they travel to the recreational sites. In this case, the time and travel cost expenses that they incur when they visit the site is what is really important. And this cost for traveling and for the time of the people is what will represent the price or the value. So what happened here, the willingness to pay to visit the site can be then estimated based on the number of trips made by a different travel cost. So it is the same, like if we look or we think about the willingness to pay for marketed goods, is basically we having a market and it's very direct. So let's put it in a simple words. What you do, you are in a place that you want to value. Let's make this example. There is a national park, you want to value the benefits in terms of recreation or biodiversity or any other benefit of the national park, what you do is you go to the place and you interview the people who are going there, how much they spend in hotels to go there, in petrol, in restaurants, in any other expense. You take that expenses, you add those, and then you know how much they value. This is used as a proxy of how much they value the national park. So it's direct. So what else from this travel cost method? It has some limitations. And the limitation is that it assumes that people perceive and respond to changes in travel cost in the same way than changes in admission price. We assume here that, okay, that willingness to pay we get, which is the cost they incur to go there, is the price. And we basically are assuming that the elasticity of that is equal to the elasticity if we put an entrance fee. It may be true, it may not. So it's a strong assumption. Second, it assumes that the people takes the trip for a single purpose, and that may overestimate the value of the good when there are multi-purpose trips. So let's say that you go to the place, but you also, during the trip, you are also visiting family, and you are also going to buy something you want in a certain place. So you have more than one purpose. It's not just going to the. So in that case, you may be overestimating the value because you are doing other things. And your willingness to pay is not just for the national park, but it's also for the other things you are doing. So it will work well when it is only a single purpose, okay? When it is multi-purpose, then we can get a bias estimate. Finally, it cannot measure option values. It only measures use value, but those values, the option values I was telling you before, or the existing values, is not taken by this technique. Okay, that is travel methods. Oh, wait a second. The advantage. Okay, sorry. I have the advantages here. The method is based on actual behavior. So rather than hypothetical, which is good, it is really what people do, actual behavior. Is not expensive to apply. And there is no much designs here. It's straightforward. And this allows for a larger sample size because people generally, when you ask them on site, they are in general willing to participate. Not like when you do surveys that are not inside. And it's very easy to interpret and explain because it's the actual behavior. Then the second, okay, any question about travel cost before I move to the second reveal preference, which is hedonic prices?
Anyone want to ask, please? If you say, you can write your question in chat.
Yeah, if not, you can just put the question in the chat. Or if you don't want to ask in English, just ask in your language and you can translate for me.
Yeah.
So feel free to, if you don't want to ask in English, just to put it in your language.
Yeah.
So, okay, so there are no straightforward questions. Let's move in here. And please feel free to just post any question in the chat or interrupt me, okay? Let's go to the second methodology, which is hedonic prices. This is the second reveal preference methodology. So in this one, we estimate the economic value of non-market goods and services that directly affect market prices. So the basic premise of this is that the price of the good is related to the characteristics of the service that is provided. Generally, we use the hedonic prices to do environmental or to value environmental quality or environmental amenities. For example, for environmental quality, we have air or water pollution. For environmental amenity, we have aesthetics views. And this is a bit, an example of this would be what I was telling you before about the price of property. So how much the property price of a certain area change when you have an area that is polluted or is not polluted. So if it is polluted, people will not like to live there, so the price of their properties will go down, and that change between the original price and the new price after you get pollution, that is the value of the, or that is considered the value of the impact. Okay, so what are the advantages of the hedonic prices? Is that estimates the value based on an actual choice. Is direct, is real, is direct behavior. So is based on actual choice. Also, we have that some data, for example, the property prices are generally very reliable and they are available. And many of this data are available and we can rely on them. And another advantage is that it allows interaction between market and non-market goods. Like, for example, the environmental quality. So we have market goods like property and non-market goods that is environmental quality. So we have the interaction between them. Those are the advantages of that. However, we have limitations as every method, which the limitation is that we need a large amount of data, not like the other that we can rely on less data. And for this, we need a large amount of data to be able to really conduct the appropriate analysis, econometric analysis. And of course, given this, this method depends on the data availability. If the data is available, happy days. If not, we cannot do this valuation. Results may change also depending model specification. So sometimes when you use a different type of model, you can get slight differences in results. That's important. So another limitation is that there is demanding in terms of statistical and econometric analysis. So you need further techniques and technical skills for that. And it has a limited scope. For example, there is a lot that is focused on housing prices, not much applied to other types of valuations. Hedonic prices has been mainly used for housing prices. So those are the limitations of this hedonic price. However, we saw that it has a different benefit as well. And that is what we have for reveal preferences. If you have any question, again, please just raise your hand or put it in the chat. So let's then do or go to a stated preference method. Just a second. The first method with a stated preference is the contingent valuation method. I don't know if you have heard about this before, but the contingent valuation method is the most common method for non-market, to value non-market goods. And it's the most common method basically for deriving non-use values. Remember, we say like the other methods will only take direct values. and use value, while the stated preference, we are able to obtain non-use and use values, or option, existing values, and use values. The continuum evaluation method is a survey-based technique. Okay, in this one, we investigate the willingness to pay or the willingness to accept for environmental goods. Some examples would be the application of these to benefit of outdoor recreation, improvements of in air quality, improvements in water quality, the benefit of wilderness areas, also benefit of reducing transport risk, benefit of conservation of certain species, for example, and we do it through the willingness to pay or willingness to accept, as I said before. Let's see how we design a continuum evaluation study. And please pay special attention to this part, because these steps are the same we use to design choice experiments with just slight changes, but it's more or less the same. And so I won't be repeating the steps later on. So the first thing we do is we conduct a focus group. So we gather people from general public, experts, policymakers, industry, or the people that are important for your study or for the type of evaluation you want to do. And we decide, we get them together, and we do the focus group to see what is really what is important to them and what we should be valuing. Then we go to design a questionnaire. And within designing a questionnaire, we have a lot of things to take into account, like choosing the appropriate survey technique. Are you doing an online survey, face-to-face survey, telephone survey, a postal survey, and why? Then you identify the relevant population and your sample strategy. Are you interviewing people, households? Are you interviewing heads of companies? Are you interviewing general population, people over 18? So you need to make clear what is your population and how is your sample technique strategy. It's a random sampling, is a block sampling, how you are doing the sampling. Once you have your questionnaire ready, okay, you go and do and conduct pilot studies and to see if your questionnaire is working. Once you have your results of the pilot study, you analyze those responses. And in general, I would say always after the first pilot study, you will have things to correct. So you correct them, and then you go again to the field and you test your survey. And you do that as many times as needed. A lot of times I get people asking me, oh, how many pilots I should do? There is not a number of pilots. You do as many pilots as you need until you get your instrument perfect. So until your instrument works good. This is key. If your instrument doesn't work, you will lose your mind and you will lose the study because you are not valuing what you want, or because your answers are not reliable, or because your answers are biased. So this is the key point of your study. So conduct the pilots and make the changes that are, and make sure that your survey works. So you analyze the responses, you modify the question according to those responses, and you conduct more pilots until the final service is ready for implementation. When it is ready, you just go to the field and do your data collection. Then your data analysis, your publication, policy advice, or whatever. Now, this is a very kind of summary of the steps, because of course within it you have to design a bid, you need to design the type of questions as well. So there is a lot of other things to consider. And okay, so contingent valuation is particularly employed for environmental goods, and more generally is employed for public goods. In general, we use a yes/no response, so it's kind of a referendum response in the type of close-ended question. And the typical question would be, if a policy A delivered positive change B, and it is in a certain agenda, would you vote for this agenda, yes or no? So this is what we call a referendum method. And is thought to be potentially incentive compatible, which means that it puts in place, the actually will tell you what they really think with this single referendum. So in general, we conduct contingent evaluation with a split samples when you want to test something and you have a treatment and a control group. It's not always, you sometimes can just go for a contingent evaluation in general for all. So for each of these subsamples, they have a bid value at which they will answer yes or not. So the proportion of yes you get, which is expected to be decreasing with the cost, then you model that statistically. So you go to people and ask, are you willing to pay X amount for conservation of whales, for example? And they will say yes or no. And you expect that the amount, the highest amount you ask, the lowest proportion of yes you will get. So a typical parametric setup of this produce a curve over the proportions. So in general, you get a curve that is negative, like a demand curve. The higher the price, the higher the price, the less people will say yes. So there are two types of questions in this. You can ask open questions or closed-ended question. So open question, when you ask an open question contingent evaluation, you ask people, how much are you willing to pay for whatever you want to value? And the people will tell you a number, £5, or in your case, 100,000 rupias, 5,000 rupias, whatever. So that is the open-ended. You ask them. What happened with open-ended is that although it may be incentive compatible, the problem is that people can tell you sometimes anything, and the variance of the response could be very high. They can go up a lot, or they can just go down. And so it's more difficult, if you say cognitively, for people to give out of the blue value. So what do you get in the market? In the market, when you go to the supermarket, you see, for example, a bottle of water, and then you say, okay, this bottle of water costs 5,000. Do you buy it or not? With that price, that's the person. Are you willing to pay 10,000 rupees for this? Yes or no? And you say yes or no. So there are three types of close-ended questions you can ask. The first one is the single bounded, which is exactly what I was telling you. Are you willing to pay 5,000 rupees for this good? Yes or no? And that is full stop. The second type is the double-bounded dichotomous choice. In the double-bounded, you ask a second question. So if the person told you yes, you increase. Okay, are you willing to pay 5,000? Yes. And would you be willing to pay 10,000? yes or no. Okay, so and we start debit. Are you willing to pay 2,000? Yes or no? And then you stop. That's the double bundle. You can then get oh well, I'm gonna come to that in a second. So that is for the double bundle. We get then that this type of method is it reduces the how to say the variance of the responses. It reduces the variance of the responses and give you a more accurate value. Okay, because people now they don't answer anything they want, but it's an interval. And the multiple bounded is you just continue asking basically. After you ask the second time, you ask a third time or a fourth time or whatever, as many times you want. Okay. So those are the type of questions. So single bounded, you ask one and then you just stop there. Double bounded, you ask one time, yeah, and you have yes, no. If they say yes, you increase. If they say no, you decrease. And then you have a yes, no. So that those are the types of. Now I'm going to give you a bit of the modeling of the continuum evaluation, and very briefly, because I don't expect you to get the econometrics and all, but you need to understand that the continuum evaluation, as well as the choice experiment, this applies also to choice experiment, are based on the utility function that is conformed by that deterministic part, which is observable for the research, and a stochastic part, which is not observable by the researcher. So, which is this error term. So, you have then Q0, which is the current or alternative or status quo. And then you have a Q1, which is the new alternative or the new situation or the environmental improvement, in which your utility function is a function of the amount you have of the good, your income, and the stochastic process. So your utility in Q1, in V1, is the amount you have, your income minus the bid. The bid is the price you are asking the person to pay, and the stochastic component. So then what you do is, because you have this random, this is a random utility model, by the way. So I didn't put it in here, but this is what we call the random utility model. And so given this random component is not observable, then we rely in probabilities. So we basically calculate the probability that people say yes to the scenario we are showing them. And the probability that they say yes is a probability that the utility in period 1 or in the situation 1 is higher or equal to the utility with the status quo. If the utility of the person improves after the environmental change, then and after they have paid a certain bid, then we have that we get a higher probability of yes. So you can, I'm gonna skip this, you can work this out. Basically, you will have the way we can write the probability of yes, which is a distribution function. And this is for asymmetric, this is the cumulative distribution function for a symmetric distribution, which is the normal distribution. So I'm gonna skip this technical part because really these 2 hours are not enough to give a full environmental evaluation course, but you have an idea of this. So the main purpose of this of this analysis is basically to estimate willingness to pay and to derive a willingness to pay function. So if you solve this, you will have here that you have the utility in period 0. To optimize this, we equal that with utility in period 1. And if you, and bid is the price or the willingness to pay. If you calculate the willingness to pay, basically you put willingness to pay where you have bid, you will find this formula, which is the way you calculate willingness to pay based on the results of an estimation. And if you see, the willingness to pay is only a function of constant. So we don't have unless we have interactive effects. Now, there are certain anomalies on contingent valuation, and I'm not going to explain them one by one because I am aware of the time, so I can get to a bit of choice experiment before finish the lecture. These anomalies. So some of the anomalies in contingent valuation are the willingness to pay, willingness to accept disparity. When you obviously, generally, when it is willingness to accept this higher than the willingness to pay, the endowment effect, and then when you get a double bounded dichotomous choice, or what I explained, you have bias or anomalies as internal consistency, inconsistency, anchoring effect, that you are anchored to the first value, embedding effect, where the willingness to pay of one element sometimes in the results seems to be the same that the willingness to pay of several elements. So that is one of the anomalies of double bounded. Some biases you get, again, I'm only gonna mention them because we unfortunately don't have the time to go through all of this, but this is not real, completely real, it's hypothetical. The insensitivity to scope, people not focusing, the warm glow, people trying to say yes because they just want to be nice and good, interviewer bias, a lot happening, prominence bias, the temporal embedding, strategic bias, which is a lot studied in behavioral economics, the starting point bias, which is what produced the anchoring effect, sequence effect when you have more than one valuation, information bias, sometimes you give more information or inaccurate information or biased information, and then you create a bias valuation. An important point to consider here as well when you design is if you use willingness to pay or willingness to accept. So the willingness to pay in case of increase of an environmental good is when we can ask what is the maximum willingness to pay to have an increase of the good, or the minimum willingness to accept to forego the increase. When we have the decrease of an environmental good, which is generally the case for contingent valuation, we can ask the maximum willingness to pay to prevent the reduction, or the minimum willingness to accept to tolerate. So basically, it depends of your context of valuation. And I would like to finish in the 10 minutes we have this lecture telling you a bit of choice experiments. Choice experiments is the second stated preference technique, which is based on attributes. The origin of choice experiment is in the marketing and transport literature, and is based in surveys, the same as in contingent valuation. So this method is based on the premise that individuals then derive the utility from the characteristics of the good instead of for the good itself. what we had before in continuing evaluation is that individuals evaluate a good, a bunch of goods or a good as a whole. In choice experiment, you are looking at evaluation of characteristics or attributes. Therefore, the goods are described in terms of attributes or characteristics and levels of those. So respondents are given a hypothetical setting and with repeated choices. I'm going to show you an example very soon. So each alternative, the choices will have alternatives, and each alternative is described in terms of numbers of attributes and levels. So the respondent are asked to choose one alternative, which is the preferred one. And when they do that, they do trade-offs, and they are revealing their preferences. So for example, let's look at this choice set. This is a choice set I used for one of the research in wind power development. So you have two projects here. We didn't put a status quo. Why? Because at that time we were in the place where we were applying this, they were going to install a wind farm. So not installing a wind farm was not an option. Status quo is not an option. So we don't use status quo. So we have this, and so characteristics, location, birds, which is the amount of birds that are heard, the area covered, and the price. So always you introduce a price so you can get the marginal willingness to pay, really. So you have two projects, and through an experimental design, which is not very straightforward, you do statistically experimental design, and you get what you feel here. And this is not like just randomly putting attributes you want to put. No, this is statistically done, the combinations of all the attributes and levels. So for example, the project A is located on mountains, while the B in the coast. The project A hoards less birds than project B, but it uses more space, 800 football pitches instead of 300. Now, project A, and so I will be willing to pay more, then I choose the B, or I don't want definitely them to be put on the coast. I prefer them on the mountain to use. Just reveal your preferences, and you are making a indirect value. You can put an this is another example from a paper in renewable energy from Berman and Hanley, where you have the landscape, wildlife, and pollution, employment, and then you have the price of electricity. Again, different combination, and in here you have an either option or a status quo, which you can choose if you don't want to choose any other option. And you can have like this several types of choice experiment alternatives. Something that I would say, like, I would suggest always go for something like this, which is simpler and people can understand, and it's easy, you get reliable answers, than if you go for things like this. This is an example of an old study as well done on climate change, where you have a lot of information and a lot of alternatives. Of course, I mean, the reliability of your decision on this type of choice set sometimes can be, discussed. So, but this is another example of choice. Okay, for choice experiment, you do experimental design to construct the choice sets, and then you can calculate marginal willingness to pay. Be careful, it's marginal willingness to pay, it's not willingness to pay. This is a typical mistake of people doing valuation. So because why marginal? Because you are getting the the willingness to pay for each attribute. So if say it's marginal, can you calculate the total willingness to pay? Yes, but generally it's gonna be limited. You can calculate the total willingness to pay if you just add the value, the marginal value for each attribute. However, because it is very likely that you are going to put all the attributes possible because of cognitive restrictions or limitations, most likely you always talk just about marginal willingness to pay. And other thing you can estimate a marginal rate of substitution between the different attributes. And the way this is modeled is exactly the same as the choice, the continuing evaluation with a random utility model. If you see, it's the same indirect utility function, but in this case, you basically will have two options, option I and option J. So you will choose the option I only if that option is give you a higher utility than option J. You see, in both you have the price, okay? And that is the way you model it, and that is the difference with the continuing evaluation one. So you calculate the probability that your utility in option I is larger than your utility in option J. And you have different assumptions you can have there. So, and I finished this lecture with the main challenge of this, which is how to integrate the nature and its value in the everyday decision. Because you will use those techniques to get the values, which is what you need. But then you need to integrate. Generally, researchers just get that, publish a paper, and that is. But what we really need nowadays, when we need really actions for nature, is to integrate these decisions or these results or these values into everyday decisions. And I always, in most of my presentations, use this scheme. So this diagram of Daly et al. 2009, in which you have economic activities. The economic activities have impacts, and which are these outcomes. Those impacts have outcomes and impact that will have an effect in ecosystem services. So there will be a change in ecosystem services. Those changes in ecosystem services will give you information. Okay, this is what's happening. And then you get to value those changes through the preference of the people. And so preferences and value are important here. That will create an information that is important, very important. And so the point is not stopping here when you have the preferences and value, but just bring this information to the policy institutions. So they can design that tax we were talking, they can design compensation scheme, they can introduce those in cost benefit analysis, they can use that for the national accounting, and we can do policy with that. So that policies are the incentives we have here, and those incentives are those that will influence the economic activity and produce a new type of production that will again change the ecosystem, hopefully with a benefit, and then we have this side. So, yeah, I'm gonna, because we are on the time now, I'm gonna stop here. And well, you got now a vision of what, how we go from market and non-market goods, and how we go to the evaluation and application of values into policy making. So, well, I open now if people have any question or anything.
Okay, anyone has questions? Anyone want to ask something? Please feel free. How is it? Or there is so many information coming to the brains.
This is valuation in a notch.
Okay.
In a nutshell, sorry.
Okay, yeah. It is still in the nutshell, not in the nut itself. It's still in the
Yes.
shell. Yeah. Anyone want to ask about the non-market valuation? Yeah, I think, yeah, it's so many information that we got in this morning, yeah, about the methods that we can use for evaluating the non-market goods, because, yeah, of course, non-market goods is quite hard to quantify. So, yeah, it is. There are some methods actually that we can use in economics. Yeah, but yeah, it's quite hard. Anyway, okay. Anyone want to ask? How is it? No.
No.
Okay. If there are no question, maybe is there any close remarks from Claudia?
Well, no, basically the closing remarks is these are techniques that are available there. We need to bear in mind that we only can use them as an indication. So they, because of the limitations and methods have, we cannot use it like the amount. It's just an indication for policy. And we always need to really get this through the use in top policymaker. That
Okay.
would be.
Thank you, Claudia, for your times and for your presentation today. Maybe that's all our discussion for this morning. Thank you for everything. Thank you for your sharing. Thank you for the knowledge that we got in this morning. Okay, then, if there are no further questions, let's close our discussion this morning by reciting Alhamdulillah. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Claudia. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Yeah. Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you, and have a good day, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.